And that kind of segues to a question that we're tackling here that IHS has thought a lot about. And what is the role of civil discourse in our political system? Because on one hand, we have seen a kind of breakdown in decency and civility and reasonableness. On the other hand, politics is inherently contentious and messy and difficult, perhaps inevitably tribal. And so my question to you both is civil discourse misunderstood in some way? Is it perhaps neglected, or is it perhaps overrated?
Whenever I hear people saying we're under crisis and things are really unbearably contentious, I read another book on the 1850s when we were arguing about big issues like could one set of human beings own another, and could we dissolve the Union and all that. And there was a dueling ground not far from where we're sitting tonight, where duels, bloodshed, death was quite normal among members of Congress. We had Preston Brooks went on the floor of the Senate, Congressman Brooks, and beat Charles Sumner nearly to death. He was out of the Senate for 2 years. That was much worse than what we're going through now. The issues were bigger and harder to split the difference on. So if you begin with the fact that politics' first job is to keep the peace, you are necessarily driven to a kind of politeness. I think one of the good things about a capitalist society is that capitalism doesn't just make us better off, which it does, it makes us better, because it's a society of consensual agreements, nonstop all day long, making contracts and making promises, so that if you walk into an American shop, the first words you hear are, "How may I help you?" There's a kind of ethos of politeness built into a market society.
I'm not so certain that I agree with George about the moral values of capitalism, but I do agree with the importance of political figures, political elites, not deliberately turning up the temperature. I mean, that's sort of what's striking about the 1850s as an example, as there was this sort of an irreconcilable issue, absolutely, that was I think inevitably going to result in conflict, given as it was tied up in sort of the political economy of the country. But at the same time, there were figures like actively working to turn up the temperature. Like we have the term the Southern Fire Eaters for a reason. They're actively trying to kind of heighten the contradictions. And that's an extreme example, but I think what people recognize in the present is that, political figures, political elites, media elites, like people in the public eye have a responsibility not to be agreeable all the time, that's ridiculous, but they have a responsibility to not aim their fire at the most inflammatory kinds of issues in the society, right? Like they have an obligation to not demagogue, to try as much as possible to engage with their fellow citizens as people capable of reason and not simply purely emotional animals. And I do think that in the present moment, there are many politicians at the very least who've sort of just abandoned this altogether or denied that it's an obligation whatsoever, and whose perspective essentially is, listen, if this works for me, then it works. And there's no regard given to the kind of effect it can have on just sort of ties between people, on cultivating mistrust and anger. That's not seen as something, rather that's seen as something that you can sort of just like set to the side. But it in fact is really meaningful if in your attempt to make a political appeals, all you're doing is dissolving a community's ability to trust itself or trust anything at all.
So that brings up a theme, or brings us closer to a theme, Jamelle, that you've written about on a number of occasions. You've written about the need for revitalizing civic virtue, and you've joked that this makes you sound sort of oddly conservative, perhaps even like George Will.
I think the exact thing I've said is that it makes me sound like a social democratic George Will.
Oxymoron alert.
That's part of the joke.
But I wonder if there's a kernel of truth in there, or maybe some sort of agreement. So what is civic virtue exactly? So how would you define civic virtue? Why might it be important in your view? And let's see if there's any daylight between your view and George's view.
I mean, I think it's sort of like I was gesturing towards it just in my previous answer. It's sort of, part of it is people engaged in political life recognizing that we are not, like, we are just one generation of Americans. There were Americans before us, there will hopefully be Americans after us, and that part of our duty is not just to pursue our partisan or ideological interests, but also to preserve this thing, the Union, the Constitution, whatever you want to call it, for the next generation of Americans. I'm really often very struck by the constant references to posterity you'll find in founding era writings. You'll find it in the Constitution itself. This notion that we're not just doing this for ourselves, but we're doing this really for future generations to be able to build for themselves a more harmonious political community. And so if that's one of our obligations, to preserve this thing, then we have to act in accordance with that. We have to act knowing that there will be a time after us, and we want to pass on to the next generation of Americans a system that at least kind of works. I mean, the American system's always been a bit shambolic, but we want to make sure it kind of works for the next generation. And I think that civic virtue has to include this basic recognition that we are not, we have obligations to the future. We simply do, and we have to honor those obligations as best as we can. And then when it comes to just how we interact with each other, I've really become, I've gained a greater appreciation for hypocrisy over the last decade or so, because part of I think Donald Trump's appeal to many voters is that he's not hypocritical, right? He's not pretending to be something he is, but it's actually important for them to pretend to be something they're not, right? It's important for people in positions of authority and power to at least gesture towards forbearance and gesture towards unity and gesture towards sort of a commitment to the whole. Even if in their practical politics they're rigid partisans, it's important to at least pretend like you care about that stuff, because it sends a signal to everyone else that this is a thing that's important to pretend about. And eventually, when you pretend about stuff enough, you'll start to care about it at least a little bit. And in thinking about what does civic virtue entail, I think part of it for practical politicians has to be at least pretending not to see everything as a zero-sum partisan competition, and acknowledging that there are values beyond whether I win the next election, whether I get the specific policy program, that there are things that are simply more important that have to be recognized.
George, would you agree? I saw you nodding your head in agreement. Would you?
Yeah, I'm a faculty brat. I grew up in Champaign, Illinois. My father taught at the University of Illinois. And according to local lore, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse that Lincoln learned that Stephen Douglas, the Illinois senator, had passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which I take to be the hinge of American history. And Lincoln, in his response, gave us a timeless lesson in how to have one bedrock position you won't compromise on, but you'll compromise on everything surrounding it. Let me explain. On the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas said, we're going to solve the vexing question of the status of slavery in the territories with popular sovereignty. Kansas, Nebraska, and the other can vote slavery up, vote slavery down. It's a matter of indifference. The important principle is majority rule. Lincoln's ascent to greatness was his implacable and canny resistance to that, saying America's not about a process, majority rule, it's about a condition of liberty. And so in his great speech on the Kansas-Nebraska Act in Peoria, he began by saying of Southerners, he said, they are exactly what we would be in their situation. So he stipulated that there's a commonality and a common tolerance built into this. And Lincoln never compromised on expansion of slavery. He compromised on everything else, proving that it's possible to have, on the one hand, an iron foundation and be marvelously flexible everywhere else. And I think that's the secret. Find your iron foundation, but also find how to maneuver